All right, good morning. Good to see everybody here. We're going to be in John chapter 18 today. John chapter 18, if you want to turn there, we'll be starting in verse 1. And last week we concluded this long discourse that Jesus gave to his disciples that in real time probably lasted or was spread out over several hours, starting out in the upper room where he was talking to them, washed their feet, gave them a clue as to what was up ahead about him leaving them and going to the Father, some comforting words he provided them. And then they headed out towards the Mount of Olives. They were leaving that upper room, going probably out the eastern gate of Jerusalem there. And there he lifts up that prayer in chapter 17 to his Father on behalf of the disciples and then also on behalf of all those who would believe on him through their word. Now as we get into chapter 17, he's moving further east, and we'll see him cross over a very, very significant historical site as he makes his way to the Mount of Olives. And that's where we pick up in verse 1 of John 18. It says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples." And so east of Jerusalem you had this Kidron Valley, which was really a ravine, or you could call it just a little dry area where there was water flowed through it periodically, but it ran all the way down to the Dead Sea. And this was a place that you would have to cross over in order to get to the Mount of Olives, which was further east of Jerusalem. So you had Jerusalem, and then you had this Kidron, and then you had the Mount of Olives. And Jesus is crossing over this to get to the Mount of Olives, where he'll lift up that famous prayer. We won't find it here in this text, but we found it in the other Gospels, where he lifts up that prayer to God, you know, if it is your will, let this cup pass from me, and so on and so forth. But this ravine of the Kidron is a very significant place and has a lot of historical background to it. If we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 15, we find that there was another person who is very much closely connected to Jesus who also crossed over this same area under similar circumstances. You might think of King David. King David, oftentimes, whether you're reading the Psalms or you're reading the historical story, the narrative of his story, oftentimes is seen as a type of Christ. He is the ancestor of Christ. It was through David's descendants that Jesus came. And a lot of things that happened to David were pointers towards or foreshadows of what would happen to Jesus later on. And this is how it is with this Kidron, this brook Kidron. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, you have David in similar circumstances. He's already been established as king over Israel. He had been a king for several years at this point, but his son Absalom rose up against him. And his son Absalom did it in a very deceitful and trickery type of way. Absalom was a very handsome man, and he would sit at the gate of Jerusalem, and when people were coming in to get judgment from the king, he would stop them and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And they would explain to him their case. And he would always give them a favorable answer. He'd always say, "Oh, if only if I was judged, I would render justice to you. I would make sure that everything went the way you wanted it to go." And he won over the hearts of the people by doing this. And eventually, he was able to bring about this great rebellion against his father David. And so after he has this great rebellion, it becomes so intimidating that even David leaves the very city that he founded, the city that was named after him, the city of David, Jerusalem. And we find that he crosses over this brook of Kidron, this ravine of Kidron as it's called in John chapter 18, and goes over to the Mount of Olives. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 23. And notice the atmosphere, the emotion, everything that makes up this whole scenario. It says, "While all the country was weeping with a loud voice, all the people passed over. The king also passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness." All right, so here David's going over, and all the people who were still dedicated to David were crossing over as well. And we could also mention Ahithophel, who also was one who is symbolic in Jesus' story, because Ahithophel did exactly what Judas did. Ahithophel was a great friend of David. He was a person who gave great advice. Everyone looked up to the words of Ahithophel, and he betrayed Jesus and David, and went over to Absalom's side. So again, another similarity there with Absalom, you could say, is a type of Satan who incited Ahithophel, who's a type of Judas, to betray him and cause this great rebellion. But anyway, so that as they're at this brook Kidron, they're all weeping. And this is a time of sorrow, of distress, of suffering. This is the atmosphere that you get here, which is very similar to what's happening with Jesus. He's about to cross over into the Mount of Olives, where he himself is going to be weeping. He's going to be crying out to his Father. His sweat is going to be sweat like drops of blood, we're told in the Gospel of Luke. Just a time of distress and suffering. And so the same experience that David had crossing over this, Jesus is having it with his disciples too as they cross over. And so you see these two stories as kind of a bookend for this Kidron Valley, or Brook of Kidron, or whatever you want to call it. These could be seen as the two bookends. Well, there's also other things that happen in between these things that I think are very significant as we think about ourselves in the spiritual life and our own experience. We see in Jeremiah 31 and verse 40 that this was a place of death. And this is still the case today. This is a place in this area, it's a place where there's a lot of tombs, there's a lot of graves in this area. And from what I've read, and it's kind of an older source, but I assume it's probably still true today, it was seen as a very prestigious thing if you're a Jew to be actually buried in this Kidron Valley. But in Jeremiah 31 and verse 40, we see that there are graves here. It is a place of death. It says, "In the whole valley of the dead bodies and of the ashes in all the fields, as far as the brook Kidron, to the corner of the horse gate toward the east, shall be holy to the Lord. It will not be plucked up or overthrown anymore forever." A messianic prophecy, but there he references that this place that was bait of death, that was symbolized death, and where there were graves, would no longer be seen as that anymore. But we were just bringing it out just to show that it was a place of death. It was also a place in which cleansings oftentimes took place by various kings. In 2 Chronicles 29:16, we see that there's been cleansings here. And this is by Hezekiah. It says, "So the priests went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it. And every unclean thing which they found in the temple of the Lord, they brought out to the court of the house of the Lord. Then the Levites received it to carry out to the Kidron Valley." So Hezekiah led some reforms. And in doing so, they cleansed out the temple. The temple had been filled with different altars and idols and things. And they just basically contaminated God's house with idol worship. And Hezekiah's reforms were to bring all that stuff out of the Lord's house and dump it off into the Kidron Valley as a way to cleanse the temple. And we saw also in a similar light, we see that this is a place where idols are often torn down, as we see in 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 13. And this is Asa's reform that we read about. It says, "He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother, because she had made a horrid image as an Asherah. And Asa cut down her horrid image and burned it at the brook Kidron." So Asa, when he became king, he took these idols and threw them into the brook Kidron. And then also in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 4, we see this happening again. This time with Josiah, it says, "Then the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the hosts of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel." So there you have Josiah taking them to the Kidron Valley and just burning them to ashes. Very similar to what happened with Moses, remember, with the golden calf, took it, burned it to ashes. Only here, they're not made to drink it like they were back then, but you can see a similarity there. So as we think about this Kidron Valley, or this brook of Kidron, this whole area, we can see that it has a lot of historical significance. So we can see that David experienced it in a very sorrowful way, in a time of suffering and hardship. We see that Jesus experiences it in the same way. But in between all that, we see that it was a place of death, it was a place of cleansing, and it was a place of the tearing down of idols. So you say, well, what does that all mean? What does all that have to do with us? Well, I would say that, oftentimes in life, we too have to cross over the Kidron. There's times in our lives when we too have to join with Jesus in this pathway of sorrow, of suffering, of distress, maybe even depression, of weeping and gnashing of teeth, we could even add. Just times of immense distress. And as we join Jesus in that process of going over the Kidron, we might think, well, this is the most horrible thing. And it is. I'm not making light of suffering. Suffering is a very difficult thing. But when we think about it in connection to the Kidron, we could also see that sometimes passing over the Kidron is actually a beneficial thing. Because on David's side and then on Jesus' side, we see that is very negative, right? They're suffering, they've been betrayed by their best friend, there's a rebellion being led up, or there's people that are coming out to try to capture them. It's a very hard time. But the things in between, the things that happened at the Kidron, oftentimes was a good thing in a certain sense. Whenever we pass over the valley of suffering, of hardship, and difficulty, oftentimes that leads to these various things. It leads to death, it leads to cleansing, and it leads to the tearing down or the removing of idols. And we see this in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1. 1 Peter 4 and verse 1, it says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of their time in the flesh, no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God." So here we see the benefit of suffering. Again, not making light of it. Suffering is hard. Suffering is difficult by very nature of what it is. By definition, it's a difficult situation. But out of that can be produced a purifying effect. Out of that can come a cleansing. Out of that can come a death to self. Out of that can come a tearing down of idols in our lives. And of course, we're speaking generally. This doesn't happen with everybody, right? Some people who encounter sufferings, they plummet even more into sin, and they run even more after their idols and things like that. But what we're talking about here is people who have a heart like David, who has a heart after the Lord, and then also people who have a heart like Jesus, who also had a heart for his Father. When they encounter sufferings, yes, it's hard, it's difficult, there's weeping, there's sorrow, there's distress, everything that we see here. But at the same time, in that process, in that time in the fire, there's a purification that's taking place. And maybe you've experienced this in times of suffering. When things are good, when life is good, it's very easy for us to slip into a lifestyle of self-pleasure, of ourselves, kind of just living after frivolous things. When life is good, we don't really take things very seriously a lot of times. We're kind of just floating through life. Life is good. We're going through our days and not really doing much introspection or really dealing with hard things and coming to the Lord in desperation and in love and devotion. We kind of just float through life a lot of times when we're going through the good times. But boy, when we hit that Kidron Valley, that's when things get real. And maybe you've experienced it before. Maybe you lost a loved one. Maybe you've encountered some type of relationship, hardship or something in connection to your relationships. And that becomes very pressing on your heart. And what do you do when you're pressed down, when you're sorrowful, when you're in those hard places? Typically, all the little frivolous things that seem so important, the things that you think were really what life was all about, all of a sudden you see it in a different light. Now all of a sudden life has gotten serious. All of a sudden now life has gotten down to the bare bones of what it means to even, sometimes you just feel like you're just existing in life. And it has a way of tearing away all the excess, tearing away all the fluff, all the things that we think are very important, and narrowing it down to what's truly important. And for those who have a heart for the Lord, what it does is it draws your heart to the Lord. We prostrate ourselves before Him, lift up our hearts and our eyes towards Him, and we begin to seek Him above everything else, because He's the only one that we can hold on to. He's the only one who can pull us through, and He's the only one who can pull us out. And so we begin to draw closer to the Lord in these sufferings as we turn our hearts and our minds towards Him. And in doing so, all these idols, all these lust and impurities and things that we were chasing after before begin to dissolve. And we begin to have a single mind once again. And we begin to direct our hearts back to Him again. And so there's a fulfillment of 1 Peter 4 and verse 1 where we see that those who have suffered in the flesh, they've ceased from sin. No longer to live according to the lust of the flesh, but to have one heart for God once again, to become single-minded. And so in those times of crossing over the Kidron, we're throwing our idols away. We're cleansing the temple, which we ourselves are the temple of the Holy Spirit, we're told. We're putting self to death because we can't find even any satisfaction in ourselves. We can only find it in the Lord. And we're tearing down all these things as we're passing through this valley of suffering. And hopefully by the time we get to the other side, when we get to the Mount of Olives, we're able to look to our Father and say, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And we're able to finally get our hearts and our minds adjusted on Him and fixed on Him again. And all the other stuff that seems so important has faded away. And so this passing over the ravine of the Kidron in John chapter 18 and verse 1 is perhaps something that's not easy to do, but maybe something necessary sometimes for us to do in life. And it can come from all different circumstances and situations, but it can help us to draw close to the Lord and to redirect our hearts to Him. So we see Him crossing over the ravine of the Kidron. It says, where there was a garden in which He entered with His disciples. Now this garden is the Mount of Olives, so they do make it there. And they begin to, you have to cross-reference the synoptic gospels to get more information of exactly what went there, but we know that that's where Jesus offered up His prayers. That's where He cried out to God. That's where He sweat the drops of blood. But then once all that was over, in verse 2 it says, now Judas also, who was betraying Him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met with His disciples. And Luke 21 and verse 37 says that that's where He would go at night when He was teaching in the temple, or He would teach in the temple during the day. And then you go to Mount of Olives at night. And of course, Judas, being a part of His disciples, would have gotten into the rhythm of this. He would have been with Jesus when He was teaching in the temple. He also would have walked with Jesus to the Mount of Olives, where He would be there with His disciples, most likely in prayer and in devotion, perhaps singing hymns. But nonetheless, He knew that this was Jesus's routine. And that's one of the things that they teach you if you want to avoid, if you ever go through terrorist training, how to avoid terrorists, how to avoid, being a victim of terrorists. Well, one thing you want to do is you don't want to have a routine. You don't have a set routine, because if people are out to get you, they're going to map out, okay, he goes here at this particular time every day, he goes here every day at this particular time, and then they can set up and then they can entrap you. Well, Jesus does this. He has a routine that makes Him vulnerable, but He does it because this is a part of the plan, right? It's not because Jesus was just being foolish. This was part of the plan. He needed to be captured to fulfill the plan of God. But nonetheless, Judas knew his routine. He knew where he would be, so they could organize, really get this plan organized, and actually be able to make it out to where Jesus was and be pretty guaranteed that He would be there, pretty sure that He would be there. And it says in verse 3, Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. All right, so you would think they were coming out, this is, I don't know if y'all watched the movie Shrek, but that's what they did when they went out to go fight the ogre. They had these lanterns and torches, and they're going out, and it's like, we got to go after this guy, and he's going to be strong and powerful, and we got to overtake him. You can see how they're a little bit intimidated by Jesus. The fact that they have this big group of individuals, which was probably a mixture of soldiers and then also people who just were kind of there for the excitement or whatever. But they're coming together with these torches and lanterns and stuff, and they're coming after Jesus, probably trying to overtake him by force. And we're going to see here in a moment that you can't overtake Jesus by force. That's not the way it's going to happen. If Jesus is going to go with these people, it's because he wants to go with these people. In verse 4 it says, "So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' And they answered, 'Jesus the Nazarene.'" Notice how they're seeking Jesus here. Haven't we been reading all this time we should seek Jesus? Well, here we can see that sometimes you're seeking Jesus for the right purposes, and sometimes you're seeking Jesus for the wrong purposes. Jesus, time and time again, would tell people, "Come follow me." Here the soldiers had followed him, but it wasn't so that they could become his disciples, learn from him, have a transformed life, and all those things. It was because they wanted to tear him down. And sometimes we might want to take inventory of ourselves and ask ourselves, what are we seeking when we follow Jesus? Do we have pure motives in following Jesus? Are we doing it for selfish reasons, or are we doing it because we really want to be devoted to him and love him above all else? But anyways, it says in verse 5, "They answered him, 'Jesus the Nazarene.' And he said to them, 'I am he.'" Here Jesus gives a great example. Again, in these 3.5 years that he had been teaching his disciples and teaching the multitudes and things, he says, "If anyone denies me, I will also deny them. When he's standing before the angels and before the Father." There's a great call throughout Jesus' teachings to never deny him. Never to say, do what Peter's going to do later on and say, "Well, I don't know the man. I don't know Jesus." Deny him either verbally by saying, "I'm not a Christian," or "I'm not connected to Christ in any way, or through our lifestyle, where we deny him in the way that we live, where we get pressured socially to do things and to say things that are contrary to the morals that Jesus has imparted to us. That's all denying Jesus. Jesus here gives an example that he didn't even deny himself. When he was asked, when they asked him, "We're seeking Jesus," or when they tell him, "We're seeking Jesus the Nazarene," Jesus didn't say, "Oh, I don't know that guy. Have y'all seen Jesus?" No, he says, I am he. He stood up, and he knew what that meant. When he said that he was Jesus the Nazarene, he knew what that meant. He knew what that was going to lead to. And still, he held fast to that name. And that's an example for us as well. When people come to us and they say, "Are you a Christian?" "I am he," or "I am she." Yes, I am. I am a Christian. I follow Jesus. I'm very, very proud to say that I'm a Christian because I know who Jesus is. I know he's the Son of God. I know that he died for my sins. And to be able to say that with confidence, even if we know that that's going to lead to sufferings and to rejection and to other things that might follow after that. We need to follow Jesus' example here. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. All right, so Judas should have been on this side of the line, but he's standing on that side of the line with this mob that had been assembled. In verse 6, "So when he said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground." And one commentator I read said that they should be very thankful that they fell to the ground, because Jesus had the power to actually have them fall into hell itself. So he's saying it's good that there was a ground there to catch them. That's the power that Jesus has. When he said, "I am," or "I am he," they all fell down to the ground, which showed that if they would have had tens of thousands of soldiers, if they had assembled the whole Roman army against Jesus, they would not have overtaken him by force. Just the very, very words of saying, "I am," knocked them down. And of course, this is definitely in line with John's theme of this is all a part of God's plan. This is all a part. The hour has now come. This is all a part of God's plan, and it's being done voluntarily by Jesus here. Therefore, he again asked them, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." In verse 8, Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way. To fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one." I says, if you seek me, let these go on their way. What is Jesus saying there? He's basically saying, take me in the place of them. In other words, let these guys go and only take me. If I'm the one that you're truly seeking, let them go. And here he's really fulfilling what he said about him being the good shepherd in John chapter 10. Remember in John chapter 10, he said, I am the good shepherd who laid down my life for the sheep. He said if a hireling, if he sees a lion coming or a wolf or something coming, he's going to basically leave the flock and get out of there to save his own life. But I'm the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And perhaps Jesus could have done this in this particular case. As the good shepherd, or if he was just a hireling and this big mob was coming, Jesus could have just up and ran and said, these guys know Jesus, I don't know Jesus, I'm out of here, and left them to die. But here he's saying, you know what, you're seeking me, just take me and leave these alone. And then, of course, this was to fulfill what he had told or had prayed to the Father about those who you have given me have lost not one. That was one of his goals, one of his mission while he was here, was not to lose any of his disciples except for the son of perdition, Judas. In verse 10, Simon Peter then, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear, and the slave's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So here, Peter gets caught up in the moment. Good old Peter, you know, he's very impulsive. He's ready for action. And he sees that Jesus is about to be taken captive. And he takes out his sword and swings it at Malchus. And it cuts off Malchus's right ear. Was Peter left-handed? That's how he was able to take off the right ear easier. We don't know. There's various scenarios that could happen where he could have cut off just the right ear. But the main thing here is that Peter's wanting to get violent. Peter's wanting to stand up for Jesus. He said, I'm willing to die for you, Jesus. If everyone else denies you, I won't deny you. And here he's got his sword ready to make good on that claim and actually fight the battles for Jesus. It's interesting that Jesus says, put the sword in the sheath. There's times when we need to put the sword in the sheath, right? Sometimes we can get caught up in zeal and passion for Jesus because we do love Jesus and out of devotion. And oftentimes it's not necessarily done with a mischievous heart. We actually feel like, yeah, we're standing for the truth. Yeah, we're standing for Jesus. But all the while we're cutting off people's ears. All the while people can't hear the gospel because we cut off their ear because we're doing it in a violent, in a rough, and in a antagonistic type of way. Sometimes we need to put our sword in the sheath. Sometimes we need to just say, you know what? I need to step back for a moment and really seek God's will in this particular situation. Not that we don't be bold in a very gentle and kind and loving way. It doesn't mean that we back down from the truths that we've come to embrace. But at the same time, going out and just ripping and tearing at people and being condescending and ugly towards people, that doesn't accomplish the goal at all. Remember, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, as the Apostle Paul says, but for the tearing down of strongholds. The battles that we engage in are battles of the mind, in which we try to tear down the ideologies and the mindsets that snuff out Christ and God and things like that. That's what we're up against, not actually verbally attacking people or physically, of course, obviously not attacking people. That's not the way of Christ. But put the sword into the sheath, he says in verse 11, the cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So here we see another kind of aspect of Peter's personality here. And we'd already seen it previously. Remember when Jesus revealed to his disciples, Peter made the great confession. He says, Jesus said, who do people say that I am? Well, some people say that you're Elijah. Others says this, that, and the other. And he says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. He says, blessed are you, Simon Peter. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but your heavenly Father. On this rock I'll build my church, so on and so forth. And then he reveals to him what it means to be the Christ. He says, well, I'm going to go into Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer at the hands of the high priest, and I'll be put to death. But then I'll be risen on the third day. And what did Peter say in that particular situation? Never, Lord. This will never happen to you. he actually rebuked Jesus. Jesus told him basically the whole plan of the Father, and he rebuked Jesus. No, that's not how it's going to happen. You should do it according to my plan, the way that I have it figured out. Peter wanted things to happen according to his mind, according to the way that he thought things should play out. And here we see it. We see that he didn't learn much. Now, even though Jesus had gone through that lengthy discourse that we went through, telling them what was about to happen, including them in that something big was about to happen, and this was all a part of the plan, Peter wanted to take that sword. He wanted to take control of the situation. He wanted to ensure that, no, this is not going to happen to you. And oftentimes that's really the source of why we're so violent, or why we're so rough with people, why sometimes we do mistreat people, because we're always trying to be in control of situations. It's because we feel like we have to control it. I want things to go the way that I want them to go, and therefore, by golly, I'm going to make it happen that way no matter what it takes, no matter what type of force it takes, no matter what type of aggression it takes. I'm going to force the situation into the way that I think. When all the while we should say, you know what, maybe I should be seeking God's will. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? And that's a significant phrase given what he had just prayed, right? Father, if you're willing, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Apparently by this point, Jesus said, yeah, this is the cup that I should drink. This is the Father's will. And if this is the cup that the Father has given me to drink, shall I not drink it? So then we get a positive example by this statement by Jesus, right? Because if you think about it, Jesus had received some very pleasurable cups from his Father. The Father had always been there to comfort him. He would always go to the mountain to pray to his Father. His Father always strengthened him. Oftentimes the Father got him out of sticky situations. The Father had always been beside him to help him, to strengthen him, to guide him, to help him. And the Father had always been there to help him and to give him those good drinks of refreshment and renewal and strength. But should he accept all of those cups and not accept this cup from his Father? Would it be fair for him to only want to drink the sweet cups of divine pleasure and joy and comfort, and not also drink the divine cup of difficulty, hardships, and trials? Sometimes in our following the Lord, that's what we want. Lord, give me that sweet cup of blessing, of always feeling happy and joyful, and always having my life laid out beautifully and everything work out just the way that I want it to work out. Give me that sweet cup of blessing. But we have to understand the same loving hands that give us those cups of that sweet cup also is the loving Father who gives us the bitter cup as well. And both of those cups have their own purposes and their own significance. And we have to be willing to take both from them. It's kind of like a parent. A parent oftentimes gives their kids apple juice. They give their kids sweet drinks, maybe a soda pop every once in a while. They give them these nice drinks. But every once in a while, a parent has to do what? They have to give them that cup of medicine that's bitter, that doesn't taste good. They've done pretty good, I think, recently of masking medicine to make it taste a little bit better, but still, it's not always pleasant to take that cup of medicine. And a kid who truly trusts their parents will, yes, take the cup of apple juice, but will also take the cup of apple vinegar cider also as well. Take that bitter cup, whatever it is that they have to drink, knowing that it's coming from loving hands, from caring hands that are looking out for their betterment and also for good in general. Jesus was able to take both, and he gives us a great example of that. Verse 12, slow down. So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. So here we have them actually arresting Jesus and bound him. Very similar to, remember Samson? Samson also was bound by the Philistines on several occasions, even by his own brethren, his own countrymen. And they would bind him, but he always had power over being bound. If you remember, Samson was the judge who was very strong, right? By the Spirit of the Lord, he was able to pull up iron gates. He killed thousands of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He was a very strong person. They would bind him, but he was always in control. And whenever he wanted to tear out of those bonds, he could do it. And this is what we find here with Jesus. Yeah, he's being bound, but he's in control the whole time. At any moment, he could have broke out of those bonds. He could have called 10,000 angels to come and rescue him. He had a lot of resources available to him, but he still willingly was bound. And we've talked about this before, but I think this really shows a lot about Jesus' character. It's one thing to endure hardship just because you just happen upon hardship. Like say, maybe, God forbid, you lose a loved one, or maybe you get laid off from your job. But there's just hardships that we endure just by living. And they just come upon us. We don't choose it. It's just something that, okay, well, here I am. I have to deal with it. I'm stuck in this situation. I have a flat tire. I can't magically wish that flat tire away. I just have to deal with the situation. This came upon me involuntarily. And those you just kind of have to deal with. But I would say the hardest suffering that you have to endure are those sufferings when you do have an option to get out, when you can get away. As kids, we used to we'd set up our tents in the backyard at home. And I even did that with our kids 1 or 2 times, where they would camp. We had set up the tent just like you were at a campsite. But you know what? That tent is right next to a nice air-conditioned home. And that tent is right next to a ready available restroom, a refrigerator full of food. It's a lot harder for a kid to stay in the tent when they're right next to their house. And they know that they can, in just a few steps, they can get out of that tent and enter into that air-conditioned home. You want to encourage a kid to stay camping all weekend, take them out in the wilderness where they don't, sounds bad, but where they don't have a choice, where there is no air-conditioned home nearby where they can step out and get out of the heat. They just have to deal with it. They just have to deal with the hardship that comes along with camping. And that's the hard part. When you can stay in the tent, knowing that the air-conditioned home, that's what Jesus is kind of doing here. Knowing that at any moment he could call 10,000 angels. At any moment he already knocked them to the ground just by saying, I am, or I am he. But, he had the power to overtake this whole situation. He could have, in all likelihood, he could have just ascended back up into heaven right there and then. Could have had the chariots of fire pick him up just like Elijah and go into heaven and be done with the whole situation. I really admire that Jesus allowed himself to be bound, even though he could have tore out of those bonds at any time. The fact that he walked all the way to Annas here, made that whole journey, at any moment could have stepped out and checked out and said, no, I'm done with this. I'm not walking the way of the cross. I admire him for that. But I'm also encouraged by that as well, as I think about that as an example provided for me. And hopefully all of us feel this way as well. Because in the Christian life, a lot of what we encounter as Christians are things that we can check out at any moment. In the hours of temptation, when we really want to do something that we're not supposed to do, or times when we don't want to do something we know we should do, in the moments of temptation, isn't it very easy to just check out? Say, well, I'll give in to the temptation, or I'll just step back and not dive into that hard situation. I'm just going to step out. So many times in the Christian life, we have a choice. Stay in the tent or go in the air-conditioned room or air-conditioned house. And the faithful Christian is going to say, I'm going to stick it out. Why? Because Jesus is in the tent. He's not in the house. And I want to be where Jesus is. And if I have to endure the heat of trials, if I have to endure the hardships, the storms of difficulty, I'm going to stay in the tent with him, and I'm going to daily choose to be in that tent with him, even though I know I could very easily check out and just go the easy route and go into the life of self-indulgence and pleasure. Will we stay in the tent with him? Well, that just about fills our time for this morning. We talked a lot about suffering. We talked about the Kidron Valley, that area of suffering, both how difficult it can be, but also the benefits that can come out of it. And as we encounter this upcoming week, as we encounter the rest of our lives, and maybe we too have to step into those valleys of difficulty and sufferings, just keep our eyes fixed on the Lord, because it might be through that process that a lot of the excess is burned away, and that we can have single eyes for God once again. But let's also follow Jesus' example as well, as we stay in the midst of sufferings and trials, even though we might can get out, but we continue to endure those for his name and for his sake, and not deny his name, but be ready to say, yes, I am a Christian. I am a believer in Jesus Christ. I do connect myself to him in life, and I will not back down from that, even if it means suffering and difficulty. So hopefully the lesson was helpful for us and will encourage us to be more faithful followers to Christ in the future. If you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Christ yet, maybe you haven't stepped into that pathway yet, we definitely give you the opportunity now to give your life to him, to step into the tent where he abides and begin your walk with him and begin that journey towards glory. If you want to do that this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that JT has prepared.